So this week's project is working with neutrals, and as I've suggested in the email with some of the examples of paintings that I've shown you, you might be wanting to work with neutrals for different reasons. You might want to mix certain subdued colours that are part of your, you might want to capture the colours that are in front of you, and some of them may well be subdued, muted colours. You might want to mix colours for shadows, where things are darker and less colourful. Or you might actually want to work with a subdued palette to create an atmospheric painting because there's not much colour. Or you might be using neutrals as part of a balanced colour scheme, a painting that might have some bright colours, but you could be choosing to balance those bright colours with areas of less colour, neutral or more neutralised colours. Or you might want to capture low light. Again, there's examples in the images I sent you of Monet working with the London smog, or early evening, early morning, where there's subdued colour because of the atmospheric conditions. So getting you to think about neutrals is just a good opportunity for me to talk a little bit about colour and remind you of some of the basics of colour theory. So there is a handout that I've attached to the email, and it's this. I've put out the colours that I use, and you may well have in your own paints if you're going to be painting. And these are the colours that I provide at the studio. So I've made a colour wheel with a yellow, a red and a blue. And I've organised these colours from my tubes of paint in such a way that they make a kind of, well, actually I started with a 6-point and I've put in a few extra points. So I've made a 6-point colour wheel, let's say that, with the ultramarine blue, the alizarin crimson red, and the cadmium yellow I've put up there. And then between those primary colours, I've put the secondary colours, and I've put my viridian green, my cadmium orange, and I've had to make a violet from ultramarine and alizarin. So that would have been the 6 points of the colour wheel, the primary colours and then the secondary colours. And then I've started to add extra points so it could eventually become a 12-point colour wheel. I've put in cerulean blue, which is a blue-green, so I've put it between the ultramarine and the viridian. And I've also put in some cadmium red, which is a red-orange. So I think the kind of convention with a colour wheel is you have the primaries and the secondaries, and then presumably they're tertiaries, and the convention is you start with the primary colour. So it's a blue-green, or if I had put something between the violet and the ultramarine, it would have been a blue-violet. So I'm trying to relate the idea of a colour wheel with complementary colours opposite each other, the blue and the orange, or the red and the green, or the yellow and the violet. I'm trying to relate that to the colours that come out of the tube. And up here is a bit of a mess, but I've just demonstrated this first point about complementary colours, and the point that's highly relevant to the whole theme of neutrals. When you mix complementary colours together, they cancel each other out. And some of these paints that I'm using here from my tubes, are absolute opposites, absolute complements. For example, I don't know, they're called absolute complements, they're absolutely complementary. So for example, ultramarine blue and cadmium orange, I don't know how clearly you'll see it here, but you'll see it if you look at the handout. As I mix ultramarine with orange, they cancel each other out. So the ultramarine blue, which is fairly colourful there, you can see on my sheet, when I add a bit of the orange to it, it becomes darker and less colourful. So it has been neutralised, the amount of colour in it has been calmed down, knocked back, muted by its opposite colour. So basically here we've gone from a brighter blue to a slightly darker and less blue mixture. At the other end, when I added the blue to the orange went from bright orange to darker orange or brown. Okay, so that you can see that's relevant to, for example, shadows. I've got a bright orange, I've got an orange, I'm painting the fruit and I want to make it darker. Well, in order to still have a kind of orange, but a darker orange that's less colourful in the shadows, I mix its orange, its opposite, ultramarine. So again, it's a bit obscured because I managed to paint over the writing, but the Viridian green, which is in my colour wheel, is a pretty good opposite to the alizarin crimson. And this one always surprises me. Cadmium red is it's a red-orange, and its opposite is the blue-green cerulean blue. So that's a bit of colour theory, mixed together complementary opposites, and you get a darker and less colourful version of your colour that you started with. So that's obviously useful when we want to start working with a subject, and that's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to show you a bit of a still life setup, and so I want to come out of this a bit. No, that's going in. Come out a little bit. There we go. So I've set things up. It's not very exciting, but I've set up a few objects in a bit of a still life, which are fairly muted in colour. So I'm sure I should be clear about these terms. So when I say working with neutrals, as I said at the very beginning, I've said in the email, that can mean different things to you. An absolute neutral is a grey, really, where there is no colour, and you might want to produce a painting that's entirely grey, but I'm more interested in refreshing your understanding of the whole idea of neutralising, of calming colours down. And so I have taken some grey objects, some brown objects, something of a muted green, and I'm going to make that my starting point, because that might encourage you to think about testing some of these principles, applying them using a still life, which I think is a good place to start. So I've tinted my canvas, because I think when you're working with colour, it's good to not have the white. So I've just made a sort of grey-brown, and I'm going to sketch out the shapes first with a bit of grey. So as I say, I've chosen some of these objects because they're fairly, they consist of muted colours, and I'm going to explain how I achieve some of those colours. I'm going to demonstrate a bit of mixing. And the point, as ever, working with colour theory and ideas about colour is to start with, trying to mix the colours that you see, but that as a starting point, so that eventually actually you can manage colour, manipulate colour to your own ends. So you might want to go on always painting the colours that you see, or you might want to be able to work with a subject and manage those colours in a way that suits you. So brighten colours, subdue colours, leave colours out, and so on. But it's always good, I think, to start with a slightly more objective approach, where you demonstrate to yourself that you can paint what's there, and then you're better placed, I think, to manage the changing, the manipulation of your subject. Right, so that's a little bit of sketching out of these objects, and now I'm just going to show you some of the colours that I've mixed and how I achieved them. So So I started with a tinted surface, a sort of browny grey, and I'm sketching out in grey, because the second thing that I could have said about colour theory is that mixing complementary colours together, well, they cancel each other out, but when you put complementary colours side by side, they liven each other up, they excite each other and make each other look more colourful. So this is just a basic principle that colours affect each other. So if I was to sketch out this, make a start of my painting with a blue line, for example, then because colours affect each other, when I put on particularly some opposite colours, like some browns or some oranges, they would actually appear more colourful next to my blue line because of the effect of that blue on the orange or the brown. So if you want to be sort of clear, you want to manage colour very precisely, by starting with a grey, I'm not going to have too much influence on those colours, my drawing stage. But equally, you could set out to use that idea of colours affecting each other by starting with a strong colour and livening everything up. Anyway, that's a slight aside. So I'm going to start by painting the tea box, and I mixed together. I've made 3 colours for that. So I began with some orange. Maybe I should do that for you. Let me just show you that. Nothing like watching somebody mix paint. So let's see. Here's my orange next to the box. And I think if I just sort of do some thinking aloud, if I add some white to that orange, and hold this mixture up against there. That's the right sort of tone, I think, for the top of the box, but it needs something else. It needs a bit of yellow. I'm going to add a bit of yellow to that. And that's what we get. It's not too bad, but I think it needs to be, it's too bright, it's too colourful. So I'm thinking about my colour wheel, and opposite my orange is my blue. So I'm going to add a little bit of ultramarine to that mixture, just to knock back the orange and try and neutralise it a little bit more. Because I think what we're seeing in that box is basically a muted yellow-orange. And that's what I get by knocking it back with a bit of blue. And I went on adding blue to that yellow-orange. And I managed to make the middle colour, which is going to go over here on that side of the box. And with even more blue, I got a darker colour for over here. So I'm just doing this to show you how I've held up those colours on the knife as I've mixed them. And that box now then I can paint with these 3 areas. That's my shadow colour, which actually, because I'm still thinking of 40 lashes, I should probably also put up here, just where the cup is, casting a bit of a shadow. So that's that one. And actually thinking about Anne Blair Brown, she does some of her exercises actually, I think you can actually buy from her website. That's my middle mixture. So it's less neutral. Actually, it's a bit dark, isn't it? It's less neutral than the first one that I did. It's still a brown. I think I made it a bit too dark. Never mind, here's my lightest one. So Anne Blair Brown, actually, you can actually buy from her website these coloured three-dimensional shapes. So boxes, cubes, like my tea box here. Well, I haven't done very well with my colours. They should be a bit lighter. Anyway, never mind. Yes, she has a whole series of three-dimensional objects, cubes, spheres, and other funny shapes for you to practice. So my tea box actually is quite a good example of that. So from there, so that was a really a series of muted yellow oranges that I've used for that box, and I added the ultramarine blue as an approximate opposite to those colours. If I want to find the colour for the plate, I could start with a yellow, and I think I'll start with the warm yellow, which is the cadmium yellow, and obviously that's far too colourful. It's far too light, isn't it? So I'm thinking firstly in terms of tone. So if I add some white to it to make it lighter. So the colour, what is the colour of that plate? It's a kind of cream. So if I hold that there, you can see that it's still too colourful. There's too much yellow in that mixture on the knife to match what's on the plate. So opposite of yellow, I've got some of that violet that I made from the ultramarine and the alizarin. And if I add some of the violet to that yellow mixture, this is what I get. This is the one that's always really surprising, I think. People are often surprised when they discover they can actually make a more muted yellow. Often people end up with green and they try and make yellow a bit, and they subdue yellow, and it's terribly disappointing. But if you can get the right opposite of a violet, then you will be able to subdue your yellow. And I also made a mixture for some of the shadows of the plate, which was again just adding a bit more violet to my cadmium yellow and white. So again, that principle that why would you want to work with neutrals? Well, you could be painting a neutral subject, but you might also want to represent shadows, and the colour phenomenon in shadows tends to be when light falls on things you see colour, and in shadows things are darker, the colour is darker and less colourful. So by learning to neutralise colours, then you can represent light and shade. So this is my colour of the plate, which doesn't really show up that well, does it? Anyway, it is the right colour. Of that I am confident. And I need a bit of it round here, a bit round there, and some in the middle. And then I made the darker version, the shadow, which is here. And there on the inside. So one other colour, we'll just spend too long mixing colour in front of you, but just that green of the cup. So I if I start with my Viridian and add some white to it, that is a pale green. It's, where am I aiming for? Maybe I should aim for the shadow actually. So that's too light. It is also a bit too green. So I'm going to add its opposite, which is the cadmium, no, which is the alizarin, which is going to give me a darker, duller green. But I think it's not got enough yellow in it. So I'm going to add a little bit of lemon yellow to that. So what I'm dealing with here is more of a yellow-green than just a green, I think. That's getting a little bit better. Could go even further towards the yellow, I think. But my starting point was a green, and to that I've added its opposite, a red, to neutralise it a bit, not to make it a completely neutral grey, but to make it a grey-green. Let's put a bit of that on, and then I'll pause, because I thought it would be good to give you some other ideas. You might want to paint a still life, but you might also want to go on to other things. And I thought today is a rainy, dull day, and I thought actually it might be quite nice to look at a landscape. I really would like to do a brighter green, a brighter area for that light bit of the cup. Needs a little bit more yellow, because it'd be quite nice in this fairly muted subject. As the light falls, the day is getting darker. Just a little bit of colour, and that was something illustrated in the email. There are some paintings by Morandi, and Morandi very often seemed to work with fairly muted objects in his still lives, but there'd often be a little touch of colour, something a bit brighter, one colour against all those neutrals and greys. So let me pause and set up just to make a few points about a landscape. So I wanted to demonstrate just briefly a landscape subject, just so that you would feel you can move on from still life. There's a value in still life objects being something you can work with quite quickly and easily to grasp the principle. But I have a problem here because I'm trying to show you the landscape. I was out this morning in the rain, so it was rather a nice, misty, dull day, but trying to show you that on the film, on the video, it's not working very well. It looks quite sort of colourful. Never mind, what I might do is just attach this photograph that I'm working from to the email, so you can see what it was I was thinking of. But I've tinted my canvas. I'm going to do a pretty tiny one here, but just to, as I say, try and illustrate a different principle. So we've got the crags and something of the city, and then that could be a bit bigger, and then a bit of a skyline. So this may be more what I say than what I do, because I've angled that so you can see it, but now I can't see it. Oh, now I can see it. That's better. So I have been working, the colours that I've mixed have all come from, initially have come from blue and orange, the ultramarine blue and the cadmium orange. So that's giving me the grey for the sky. So that's the cadmium orange, the ultramarine, and some white. So that's the kind of grey in the sky. And then there's a line of, there's a skyline, and I've just continued with my same mixture of ultramarine, cadmium orange and white. So there's a bit less white this time, and possibly a little bit more blue. So that's giving me my distant skyline. And then there's still not a lot of colour in the nearer band of buildings, which is sort of down here, there. So I got a little bit darker, a little bit less white. Maybe there are one or two things that I would use that same mixture, one or two steeples, into the general sort of distant grey. And then still keeping with the ultramarine and the cadmium orange, I added a bit of yellow, a bit of cadmium yellow, for what is now the closer trees. I don't think that's come out terribly well on the camera, but there's a slightly greener hint to those greys, because they still are greys. And then I've continued to add yellow to my mixtures of cadmium orange and and ultramarine, and that's going to start giving me some of these greens of the foreground. And then some of those greens are brighter. And so I've added a bit more yellow and a bit more, I actually added a bit of viridian as well. So my colours are gradually moving away from the grey, but my starting point for all of those was the orange and the ultramarine. As I say, it's not coming out well on the film. The image on the screen that you're looking at, but I'll send you that separately. I don't know if I can do anything different. Doesn't really matter. It's getting worse like that. So what I've tried to illustrate then, thinking about neutrals and when you would use neutrals, well, probably all the time. If you're painting what's in front of you, then there will be colourful areas, and there will be subdued colours, perhaps because of shadows or just because the colours aren't bright colours. And the quickest and probably the cleanest way to calm a colour down is to add its complementary opposite. There are other ways, which I'll briefly mention now. You can add grey. So I think we talked about this before. Val had been doing some work where she had Payne's grey and she added a bit of grey to everything. That calmed it down. You can add brown, which is a bit like grey as well. It's another neutral. Or you can add black. And if you wanted a lighter colour, you can also add white, because white will also dilute the colour, take some of the colour out of colours. But I think the cleanest way, and the way in which to get, and this sounds like a contradiction, but to get sort of cleaner, almost more vivid, distinct neutrals, is to add the complementary opposite. So I suggest you start with something simple in front of you, some objects, bright colours if you want, and if you want to work with bright colours, then make sure you paint the shadow area, paint the shadows that are cast, or perhaps work with a few very muted colours and try and faithfully represent them. And then perhaps look for another subject, and it might be a landscape, as I've been doing here on a dull day, or it might be something else. And apply this principle of making neutrals, and decide, you might want to produce a painting that is just faithful in its colour, whether there are bright areas or dull areas. Or you might want to look for the atmosphere of a muted palette, and it might be Monet's idea of particular atmospheric conditions. It might be like Morandi, where he took these kind of plain objects, but with this restricted, reduced palette, created something of a drama. Okay, well, I look forward to seeing what you're doing, and you'll maybe show me a sketch, show everybody a sketch on Monday, or just some plans